April 1945, somewhere west of the Rhine. The war was nearly over, but the fear inside the camp felt eternal. Behind the barbed wire, dozens of German women sat in silence, their gray uniforms stained by mud and exhaustion. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, nurses, clerks, radio operators. Yet war had turned them into prisoners all the same. An American soldier walked slowly down the muddy path between the tents, a wool blanket folded neatly in his arms. The wind whipped across the open field, carrying the faint smell of smoke and wet earth. When he stopped in front of one of the women, she recoiled. Her lips trembled as she whispered in German to the others, "Nicht anfassen." Don't touch that blanket. The warning spread down the line like wildfire, a murmur of fear and misunderstanding. The soldier paused, confused. To him, it was a simple act of kindness in a world torn apart. To them, it was a threat wrapped in wool. And in that fragile silence between captor and captive, two sides of a broken world tried to understand what mercy looked like in war. By the spring of 1945, the German war machine was collapsing from within. The Allies had broken through the Siegfried Line, the Ruhr was surrounded, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was disintegrating into fragmented pockets of resistance. In this chaos, tens of thousands of German soldiers, and for the first time in large numbers, women, fell into Allied hands. These women weren't front-line fighters. Most had served as communication clerks, nurses, and auxiliary members of the Luftwaffe Helferinnenkorps, or Wehrmacht female support units. Their purpose had been logistical, not combat. But as the Reich crumbled, their uniforms marked them as enemies nonetheless. The U.S. Army, advancing rapidly through western Germany, had not prepared for this. Its prison and processing facilities were designed for men, hardened infantry, SS officers, tank crews, not frightened young women barely out of adolescence. Reports from field commanders described the confusion of suddenly handling female enemy personnel, something never accounted for in the official manuals. Temporary holding areas were set up in open fields and bombed out. Warehouses near towns like Remagen, Koblenz, and Bad Kreuznach. Barbed wire fences divided the prisoners from the Allied supply lines, while hastily constructed tents provided minimal shelter. The conditions were harsh, but not deliberately cruel, a reflection of wartime logistics stretched to their limit. For the German women, however, fear overshadowed everything. Rumors had circulated for months about what awaited those captured by the Americans or Soviets. German propaganda had painted a picture of barbaric treatment, humiliation, violence, and degradation at the hands of the victors. Many of these women believed surrender was a fate worse than death. So when the Americans arrived, polite, silent, offering rations and blankets, the gestures were met not with gratitude, but with terror. In the women's minds, no kindness could be trusted. Every offer might hide a trap. One U.S. Army report from April 1945 noted this psychological barrier. Captured German auxiliaries remain highly suspicious. They refuse food, water, and medical attention, assuming deception. Some would not even approach the American medics sent to treat their frostbite and infections. The scars of Nazi indoctrination ran deep. Still, among the Americans, confusion gave way to empathy. Many of the guards were barely older than the women they watched over. Farm boys from Kansas, mechanics from Michigan, unprepared for the sight of young female captives trembling at the sound of an English word. The human dimension of war was suddenly laid bare. 2 generations, 2 nations, both exhausted and afraid of each other. And yet, behind the fences, another reality began to form, one where suspicion slowly gave way to fragile understanding. That transformation, however, began not with words, but with something as simple as a wool blanket. The U.S. Army faced a delicate dilemma. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, all prisoners of war, regardless of gender, were entitled to humane treatment, food, shelter, and medical care. But these regulations had been written with male combatants in mind. There were no clear procedures for the sudden influx of female POWs captured on the Western Front. In early 1945, field commanders scrambled to adapt. Reports from the U.S. Army's prisoner of war branch show that women were often separated from male prisoners and placed in smaller compounds within larger camps. They were assigned female interpreters when available, though shortages meant most interactions happened through gestures or basic German phrases. What's remarkable is that, despite the logistical strain, the U.S. military sought to maintain discipline and decency in how these women were handled. Orders from the European Theater Command explicitly instructed guards to prevent harassment, fraternization, or any breach of Geneva guidelines. Respectful distance is to be observed, one memorandum read, regardless of the prisoner's gender or appearance. But mistrust ran deep. The German women, many indoctrinated by years of propaganda, were certain that capture meant abuse. Nazi broadcasts had filled the airwaves with horror stories, false accounts of American troops mutilating prisoners or handing women over to foreign labor camps. Even when kindness was shown, it was filtered through suspicion. That's where the blanket came in, a small but potent symbol. U.S. Army supply trucks distributed blankets and field rations to new captives, part of standard POW intake. But for the German women, these gestures triggered panic. Some believed the blankets carried disease, others that they had been stolen from dead civilians. The fear of contamination, both physical and moral, had been planted deep by years of Nazi indoctrination. And yet, among the American ranks, not everyone dismissed that fear with frustration. Many GIs saw their own sisters or mothers reflected in these young German auxiliaries. After months of brutal combat, seeing women in uniform, frightened, hungry, clinging to dignity, reminded them that the enemy, too, bled and wept. The contrasts were profound. In Soviet captivity, German female POWs faced one of history's darkest ordeals: violence, forced labor, and starvation. In American custody, though conditions were harsh, systemic abuse was rare. Historians later noted that many U.S.-run camps in Germany and France provided better shelter and medical treatment than German civilians were receiving in the ruins outside. Still, the emotional gap between captor and captive couldn't be bridged overnight. Every movement, every gesture carried weight. A guard offering water might be met with trembling hands. A smile could be misread as mockery. The war had taught both sides to dehumanize the other. Now, standing face to face across barbed wire, they had to relearn what it meant to see one another as human. That fragile rediscovery, born from fear, hesitation, and the quiet offering of a blanket, set the stage for one of the most unexpected exchanges of compassion in the closing days of the war. Inside the barbed wire fences, fear became its own kind of language. The German women, huddled together in makeshift tents, spoke in whispers that traveled faster than the cold. Every sound outside the wire, the crunch of boots, the rattle of metal, triggered waves of anxiety. To them, capture was not survival. It was humiliation. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Allied soldiers as monsters. Posters and radio messages warned that American troops would torture or violate German women. The regime's final months only intensified those lies. By April 1945, many of these women had lost their families, their homes, and the only identity they knew, that of servants of the Reich. Now, stripped of power, they were told their captors were inhuman. So they braced for the worst. When U.S. guards first appeared with supplies, bread, coffee, and blankets, the women froze. Some refused to move. Others cried quietly, clutching each other's hands. To them, even kindness felt like manipulation. The act of accepting something from an enemy felt like surrendering one's dignity. A young American private later wrote in his diary from a camp near Andernach, "They looked at us as if we carried death in our pockets. I offered one woman a can of milk. She just stared and shook her head. I thought she didn't understand, but maybe she did, and just couldn't believe it." That disbelief became the invisible wall separating them. To the U.S. soldiers, they were prisoners in need of care. To the German women, they were the faces of everything they had been told to fear. Rumors inside the camp only deepened the divide. Some whispered that blankets were infected. Others claimed the food was drugged. Even touching an American item might mark you as a traitor to your homeland. A psychological residue of totalitarian loyalty that lingered even after defeat. But behind that fear lay another layer: guilt. Many of the women had seen the devastation their nation's war had caused. Some had treated wounded soldiers from concentration camp units. Others had heard the whispers of atrocities committed in the East. Their fear of American kindness wasn't only propaganda, it was also a mirror of conscience. Deep down, they wondered, if we had won, would we have shown mercy? That question haunted the long nights inside the fences. Between the flickering oil lamps and the silent sentries, these women found themselves wrestling with something no training manual had prepared them for: the moral weight of defeat. And yet, across the same fence, young American soldiers were struggling with their own thoughts about vengeance, justice, and mercy. For every rumor that fueled mistrust, there was a gesture that hinted at understanding. It would take a single moment, one silent offering of warmth, to crack that wall of fear and remind both sides that war had not completely erased their humanity. The humanitarian and military angle, while fear dominated the prisoners' minds. Discipline defined the Americans' response. The U.S. Army's policies toward POWs, though imperfect, were rooted in the Geneva Convention, and by 1945, American commanders understood that how they treated captives would shape the world's judgment of their victory. To the average U.S. soldier, however, this was not a grand moral equation. It was simply what decency demanded. They had seen too much death, too much brutality, to continue it unnecessarily. The war had stripped men of innocence, but not all of them of empathy. Many guards were astonished by the state of the German women they encountered. Starvation, exposure, and exhaustion had reduced them to frail, trembling figures wrapped in tattered gray wool. Some were still wearing Red Cross armbands from their days as field nurses. Others had marched for days before surrendering. For them, captivity meant, paradoxically, the first real chance to rest. American quartermasters distributed rations, clean water, and, when available, army blankets. It was a simple gesture of protocol, not pity. Yet, within that gesture, something deeper stirred. The very act of giving warmth to the enemy blurred the lines of war. But this compassion existed within strict boundaries. Regulations forbade any form of fraternization. Guards were ordered not to touch the prisoners, not to enter their tents, not to speak more than necessary. Violations could result in court-martial. The military feared both moral compromise and the collapse of authority. So, between the two groups, only silence and distance remained, broken occasionally by cautious acts of humanity. One recorded incident from a camp near Rhine describes how a young American medic tended to a German woman suffering from frostbite. He left food and a blanket outside her tent without saying a word. When he returned the next morning, both items were gone, replaced by a single note in shaky German handwriting. Danke, aber bitte nicht näher kommen. Thank you, but please don't come closer. It wasn't rejection. It was gratitude wrapped in fear, a reflection of how war distorts even kindness. For the U.S. Army leadership, such exchanges carried strategic importance too. They wanted their treatment of German POWs to contrast sharply with Nazi and Japanese brutality. In a post-war Europe that would soon be divided between American and Soviet zones, reputation mattered. Fair treatment became both moral duty and political weapon. Still, for the soldiers standing in the cold, those calculations didn't matter. They saw only the human face of the defeated enemy, weary, broken, and confused. Some guards admitted in letters home that they could no longer hate them. Others said that seeing those women reminded them of the sisters they left behind. And it was in one such camp, under the watchful eyes of both fear and duty, that a simple exchange, a soldier offering a blanket and a woman recoiling, would become the defining moment that revealed how deeply mistrust ran and how fragile compassion could be in the shadow of war. It happened one cold morning in April 1945. The sun was just beginning to burn through the mist that hung low over the camp near Bad Kreuznach. Rows of exhausted prisoners sat in silence, their breath forming faint clouds in the air. The night had been bitter. Frost clung to the tent ropes. An American supply truck pulled up to the wire, loaded with crates, rations, medical kits, and army blankets. A young soldier, Private William Carter of the 95th Infantry Division, was assigned to distribute them. He was 21, barely out of college before the war had pulled him into Europe. He moved cautiously, handing the blankets through the wire to a line of women guarded by MPs. When he reached one, a German radio operator named Lieselotte Weber, perhaps in her mid-20s, she stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. Her hands stayed at her sides. The blanket hung between them like a question. Carter gestured again. "It's for you," he said softly. But she didn't move. Instead, she whispered something that rippled down the line. "Nicht anfassen. Don't touch that blanket." The others turned their faces away. Some covered their mouths. To them, this wasn't an act of mercy. It was a trap, a symbol of surrender, contamination, or humiliation. Carter froze, unsure what to do. Behind him, another GI muttered impatiently, "Just leave it, Bill." But something in her trembling expression stopped him. Instead of forcing it, he slowly set the blanket on the ground inside the wire. Gently, like placing a fragile object. Then, without another word, he stepped back. The German women watched in silence as he turned away. The gesture was simple, but it broke something in the air. The constant current of fear. For the first time, the kindness didn't demand anything in return. Hours later, when the guards returned to the line, the blanket was gone. No one admitted to taking it, but everyone knew what it meant. The fear had cracked, even if only slightly. The next morning, when the Americans came again, no one said, "Don't touch that blanket." By the following day, the camp felt different. The tension that had hung like a wire between the captives and their guards had loosened, just a little. The women no longer flinched when the Americans approached. They still kept their distance, but the eyes that once darted away now lingered for a heartbeat longer. Cautious, watchful, but no longer filled with terror. When Private Carter returned with supplies, he noticed small changes. A few of the women nodded in acknowledgement. One even whispered "Danke" under her breath. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was the first thread of understanding. That morning, he noticed something else. The same blanket he had laid down the day before. It was now draped over Lieselotte's shoulders. She didn't meet his gaze, but she didn't turn away either. It was a moment that would never be recorded in any military report. No medal would be given, no commander would mention it in a briefing. But among the prisoners, word spread quietly. The American left the blanket and didn't force her to take it. For the German women, it meant something profound. Not all kindness hid a danger. For the Americans, it proved that compassion could exist without victory being compromised. Later that week, more interactions followed. Cautious exchanges of simple humanity. A soldier offering a tin of coffee to the nurses. Another leaving a small bar of soap at the fence. Tiny, silent gestures that said more than any peace treaty could. In war, large battles decide the headlines. But it's moments like these that decide what kind of peace follows. When the blanket was finally accepted, it wasn't just fabric. It was a bridge, a quiet truce born not from surrender, but from shared exhaustion, the recognition that both sides had seen enough pain to last a lifetime. As the spring sun began melting the frost from the wire fences, the same women who once warned, "Don't touch that blanket," now used those blankets to keep each other warm through the cold nights that remained. And for the first time since their capture, they slept, not as enemies, but as human beings. By mid-May 1945, the guns had finally fallen silent. Germany had surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. Yet, for millions of prisoners, men and women alike, captivity did not end with the armistice. The German female POWs held in U.S. custody now faced an uncertain limbo between war and peace. In camps across France and Western Germany, Allied command began the enormous task of processing, classifying and eventually repatriating prisoners. Female auxiliaries like Lieselotte Weber were officially listed not as combatants, but as Wehrmachtshelferinnen, military assistants. This classification meant they were treated as POWs under the Geneva Convention, but with limited privileges. Their release would depend on interrogation results and assessments of political loyalty. Conditions gradually improved. With combat operations over, supply lines reopened, bringing better food, clean water, and medical supplies. American Red Cross workers, some of them women, began visiting the camps, a reassuring presence for the captives who had lived weeks in fear. Letters were allowed, censored but delivered. Family names were recorded. Humanity, long suspended, was beginning to return. But for many of the German women, the emotional scars of captivity remained. The fear that had defined their surrender lingered even after the guards' behavior proved otherwise. Some wrote later in memoirs that they struggled to reconcile the difference between propaganda and reality. One nurse, captured near Trier, wrote, "They brought us food and blankets, and I realized everything we had been told was wrong. It was not the Americans I feared then. It was what our own leaders had made us believe." Meanwhile, for the American soldiers, the experience also left a mark. Many had arrived in Europe hardened by months of brutal fighting, Ardennes, Hürtgen Forest, the Rhine crossings, but now found themselves guarding the very people they had been trained to hate. Letters home revealed a shift. "They looked just like folks back home," one GI wrote to his mother, "only thinner and more tired." In those last weeks of occupation duty, moments of silent compassion became the most human part of their service. The war was ending, but the struggle to rebuild trust between nations and within the human heart had only just begun. As the months passed, the barbed wire fences that had divided captor from captive began to come down. By early 1946, most of the German female POWs held by U.S. forces were transferred to larger collection points for repatriation. Their names were checked against intelligence lists, their political affiliations reviewed, and those cleared of Nazi Party involvement were sent home, many to ruins that barely resembled the towns they had left. When they crossed the Rhine back into a defeated Germany, the silence was haunting. Cities lay in ash, trains stood frozen on twisted rails. For women who had once feared American soldiers more than bombs, the irony was not lost. It was now the Americans who were feeding their starving people. Some of the former prisoners would later speak publicly about their experiences, though most stayed quiet. The shame of defeat, the collapse of ideology, and the memory of their fear made it difficult to explain what had happened. But fragments of truth survived in diaries, letters, and oral histories collected decades later. One such account came from a former Luftwaffe clerk captured near Mainz. She recalled the night she first used the American blanket. "It smelled of smoke and wool. I held it tight because it was warm. I didn't think of who gave it to me, only that, for the first time, I could sleep. That small act, one blanket, one moment, came to symbolize a bridge between two sides of a war that had dehumanized both. For the Americans, those experiences carried forward into the occupation period. The discipline and decency shown toward POWs became the foundation for how the U.S. military managed post-war Germany. Compassion was not weakness. It was the beginning of reconstruction. Historians later noted that these encounters, unrecorded, uncelebrated, shaped post-war attitudes on both sides. The German women who survived captivity often became voices of moderation in their communities, remembering that mercy had not been a myth. And the American soldiers who had once stood guard over their fear carried home a quiet lesson: that victory without humanity was only half a triumph. The war had ended in Europe, but in those camps, among the cold tents and wool blankets, something even more enduring had survived: the proof that kindness could outlast the cruelty of war. In the grand histories of World War II, this story is easy to overlook. No medals were awarded, no official photographs taken, no names etched into stone. Yet somewhere in a forgotten camp in Western Germany, the quiet exchange of a single wool blanket told a truth far greater than any battle report. War, in its vast machinery, thrives on dehumanization. It turns faces into uniforms, compassion into risk, and mercy into weakness. But at the edges of that machinery, where exhaustion outweighs hatred and silence replaces gunfire, the human spirit finds small ways to resist. The German women who once whispered, "Don't touch that blanket," were not cowards. They were products of fear, indoctrinated to believe that mercy could not exist beyond their borders. And the young American soldier who placed that blanket on the ground didn't act out of heroism. He simply refused to let the war dictate what decency meant. History remembers generals, battles, and treaties. It rarely remembers gestures: a piece of bread shared, a wound cleaned, a blanket offered without demand. Yet, these were the quiet victories that rebuilt the moral ground after the world's darkest years. When the war ended, those who survived carried home more than scars. They carried the weight of moments like this: proof that empathy could outlast propaganda, and that kindness, once given, could ripple through memory long after the barbed wire was gone. The world rebuilt itself on the ruins of cities and nations, but also on the fragile bridges of humanity formed in places no one thought to look. And so, the next time history speaks of surrender and victory, of occupation and liberation, remember the moment when one soldier set down a blanket, and an enemy finally reached for it. Because in that simple act, war's cruelty met its quiet contradiction: that even amid ashes and fear, compassion was still possible.